The old community center was finally quiet. After hours of loud singing, off-key guitar playing, and children practicing their dance routines, the building had settled into peaceful silence. Only the soft sound of a mop hitting the floor broke the calm. Betty moved slowly through the main hall, her gray hair pulled back in a simple bun. At 71, she had been cleaning this building for nearly 20 years. Her back ached a little more each day, but she never complained. This job had been her lifeline when she needed it most. The talent show rehearsals had run late tonight. Parents had finally packed up their kids and headed home, leaving behind empty water bottles, candy wrappers, and the usual mess that came with excited children. Betty didn't mind. She had seen it all before. Every year the same chaos. Every year the same dreams of stardom from kids who could barely carry a tune. She pushed her cleaning cart toward the stage area. The old piano sat there like it always did, its black surface dusty and forgotten. Most people walked right past it without a second glance. But Betty always paused when she reached it. Tonight was no different. She set down her spray bottle and pulled out a soft cloth. Gently she began wiping down the piano's surface. Her touch was careful, almost loving. She cleaned each key individually, making sure no dust remained. This wasn't part of her official duties, but she did it anyway. The piano was old, probably from the 1960s. Its bench was worn, and some of the keys stuck a little when pressed. But Betty could see its potential. She knew what this instrument was capable of, even if nobody else seemed to care. As she worked, she hummed quietly to herself. The melody was complex and beautiful, though she barely realized she was doing it. It was just something that came naturally to her, like breathing. The sound of footsteps made her look up. 3 women were walking back into the hall. They were part of the organizing committee for the talent show. Betty recognized them, but had never spoken to them much beyond polite greetings. "Oh, you're still here," said Linda, the head organizer. She was a busy woman in her 50s, always carrying a clipboard and checking her watch. "We just came back to grab some papers we forgot." Betty nodded and continued cleaning. She preferred to stay invisible during these interactions. Less conversation meant less chance of awkward questions about her life. The other 2 women, Carol and Diane, were chatting about the rehearsal. "Did you hear Tommy trying to sing that country song?" Carol laughed. Bless his heart, but he sounded like a dying cat. "And what about the Johnson twins with their magic act?" Diane added. "They dropped every single trick they attempted." Betty listened but didn't join in. She had learned long ago that it was better to keep her thoughts to herself. These women meant well, but they lived in a different world than she did. Linda walked over to where Betty was cleaning. "You know, Betty, you spend a lot of time with that piano. Do you play?" Betty's hand froze for just a moment on the keys. The question caught her off guard. "Oh no," she said quickly. "I just like to keep it clean." But Linda wasn't easily dismissed. She had noticed something in Betty's expression, a flicker of something deeper. "Come on, you must know something about music. You always hum such pretty melodies." Carol and Diane had stopped their conversation and were now watching with interest. Betty felt uncomfortable under their attention. She wasn't used to being the center of focus. "I really don't play," Betty insisted, her voice soft. She turned back to her cleaning, hoping they would lose interest and move on. But Linda was persistent. "Oh, come on, Betty, don't be shy. I bet you could play something simple. Maybe Mary Had a Little Lamb or Happy Birthday." The suggestion made Betty's stomach tighten. If only they knew how far from the truth that was. But she had worked hard to build this simple life, this quiet existence where nobody asked too many questions. "I should finish cleaning," Betty said, trying to redirect the conversation. "You ladies probably want to get home to your families." But now Carol was getting excited about the idea. "You know what? This could be fun. Betty, why don't you try to play something? We won't judge. It's just for fun." Diane clapped her hands together. "Yes, oh, this would be so cute. Our cleaning lady playing piano. We could even record it for social media." Betty felt her cheeks burn. They meant well, but they had no idea what they were asking. She had spent decades trying to forget, trying to move on from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. "Please," she said quietly, "I really can't." But the 3 women were now fully invested in the idea. They saw it as harmless entertainment, a sweet story about their humble cleaning lady attempting to play piano. They had no way of knowing the weight their simple request carried. Linda sat down on the piano bench and patted the space beside her. Come on, Betty, just sit here for a minute. You don't even have to play. Just sit. Betty looked at the bench, and for a moment she felt dizzy. How many hours had she spent on piano benches just like this one? How many concerts, how many practice sessions, how many moments of pure joy and music? I really should get back to work. She tried one more time, but Carol was already pulling out her phone. Oh, this is going to be so sweet. Our Betty at the piano. Just think of the likes this will get. Diane was nodding enthusiastically. The whole community will love this. You know how people love these feel-good stories. Betty realized they weren't going to let this go. These women had latched onto their idea, and they wouldn't give up easily. They saw her as a character in their story, a prop for their entertainment. She looked at the piano keys, clean and white under the hall's fluorescent lights. Part of her wanted to run, to grab her cleaning supplies and disappear into the storage closet until they forgot about their silly idea. But another part of her, a part she had kept buried for so long, stirred slightly. It was like a distant memory trying to surface, a whisper from a life she had deliberately left behind. The three women were still talking, still encouraging, still treating this like a fun game. They had no idea they were asking her to open a door she had sealed shut 20 years ago. Betty stood frozen beside the piano, her cleaning cloth still clutched in her weathered hands. The three women continued chatting excitedly about their idea, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside her. Come on, Betty, Linda said with a warm smile. It'll be fun. What's the worst that could happen? If only she knew, Betty thought. The worst had already happened years ago in what felt like another lifetime. But these women saw only a shy cleaning lady who needed a little encouragement. Carol was already adjusting her phone to get the perfect angle. This is going to be such a heartwarming video. You know how people love stories about ordinary folks with hidden talents. I don't have any hidden talents, Betty said quietly. But her voice was so soft that the women barely heard her over their own excitement. Diane had found some sheet music left behind by one of the rehearsal groups. Look, here's some simple songs. Maybe you could try Amazing Grace? Everyone knows that one. Betty glanced at the sheet music and almost smiled despite herself. The arrangement was so basic, so simplified, that it looked like something from a beginner's book. But she caught herself before the expression could fully form. Ladies, please, she tried again. I really think you're making too big a deal of this. But Linda was having none of it. She had made up her mind, and when Linda decided something, it usually happened. That's how she had organized successful talent shows for 15 years running. Betty, you've been working here longer than anyone. You've watched hundreds of kids practice on this piano. You must have picked up something just from listening. That much was true. Betty had indeed watched countless children stumble through their pieces. She had seen their small fingers search for the right keys, heard their frustrated sighs when they hit wrong notes. She had wanted to help so many times, but that would have meant revealing too much about herself. Carol lowered her phone for a moment. You know what? We don't even need to record it if you're uncomfortable. We just want to hear you try. It's just us girls here. The kindness in her voice almost broke Betty's resolve. These women weren't trying to be cruel. They genuinely thought they were encouraging her, pushing her out of her comfort zone in a gentle way. I appreciate what you're trying to do, Betty said, her voice barely above a whisper, but I'm really not the right person for this. Nonsense, Diane said firmly. There's no wrong person for music. Music is for everyone. The statement hit Betty like a physical blow. How many times had she heard those exact words? How many times had she said them herself to nervous students, to young performers who were afraid to take the stage? Linda patted the piano bench again. Just sit down, Betty, that's all. You don't have to play a single note if you don't want to. Betty looked at the bench, its worn leather surface cracked with age. She knew that if she sat down, something inside her would shift. The careful walls she had built around her past would start to crumble. But the three women were waiting, their faces full of expectation and encouragement. They had been kind to her over the years, always greeting her warmly, always treating her with respect despite her humble position. How could she disappoint them completely? Slowly, Betty set down her cleaning cloth. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she hoped the women wouldn't notice. She walked the few steps to the piano bench and hesitated. That's it, Carol said encouragingly. Just sit down, see? Nothing scary about that. Betty lowered herself onto the bench, and immediately her body remembered. Her back straightened automatically. Her feet found the proper position on the floor. Her hands, without conscious thought, hovered at the right height above the keys. The women noticed the change in her posture but didn't understand what it meant. To them, she just looked a little less nervous. "Perfect," Linda said. "Now you don't have to do anything fancy. Maybe just press a few keys. Make some noise, make some noise." Betty almost laughed at the phrase. She had spent her life making music, not noise. But she understood what Linda meant. She looked down at the keys, and for a moment time seemed to slip away. She could hear echoes of all the music this piano had witnessed. The children's halting practice sessions, the frustrated scales, the occasional burst of joy when a young student finally mastered a difficult passage. "Maybe just try one note," Diane suggested gently. "Any note at all." Betty's right hand moved almost involuntarily toward middle C. It was the note she always started with when testing a new piano, the foundation from which all other music grew. Her finger touched the key but didn't press down. She could feel the resistance, the potential for sound just waiting to be released. "Go ahead," Carol whispered, her phone ready but held respectfully at her side. "Whenever you're ready." Betty closed her eyes for a moment. In her mind, she could see herself at 25, sitting at a concert grand in front of 2,000 people. She could remember the weight of expectation, the thrill of performance, the absolute certainty that this was what she was born to do. Then she saw herself at 45, selling her piano to pay for medical bills. She remembered the silence that followed, the empty space where music used to live. "Betty?" Linda's voice was gentle, concerned. "Are you okay?" Betty opened her eyes and realized she had been sitting still for nearly a minute. The three women were watching her with worried expressions. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to rise from the bench. "I don't think I can do this." "Wait," Diane said quickly. "Don't give up so fast. What if we make it even simpler? What if you just touch the keys? You don't even need to make a sound." Betty paused, half standing. The suggestion was almost silly, but something about it appealed to her. Just to touch the keys again, to feel their familiar texture under her fingertips. She sat back down, and this time she didn't hesitate. Her hands moved to the keyboard, and she gently placed her fingers on the keys without pressing them down. The position felt like coming home. Carol noticed how naturally Betty's hands had found their place. "Oh my goodness," she said softly. "Look how perfectly your hands fit on the keys." Linda leaned forward, studying Betty's hand position. "You know, that actually looks very professional. Are you sure you've never had lessons?" Betty felt exposed, as if her careful disguise was slipping away. But she was committed now. The women had seen too much for her to simply walk away. "Maybe," she said carefully. "I took a few lessons when I was very young." It wasn't a lie, exactly. She had taken lessons when she was young. She just didn't mention the decades of study that followed, the competitions, the performances, the life built entirely around music. "I knew it," Diane exclaimed triumphantly. "I could tell you had some experience. The way you clean this piano, the way you hum, it all makes sense now." Betty's heart was racing. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and any movement might send her tumbling into the abyss of her past. But there was also something else stirring inside her, something she hadn't felt in 20 years. It was small and fragile, but it was definitely there. It was the desire to play again. Betty's fingers rested on the keys, and for the first time in 20 years, she felt the familiar coolness of ivory beneath her fingertips. The three women watched with encouraging smiles, completely unaware they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Just one note," Linda said softly. "That's all. Just to hear what it sounds like." Betty's index finger pressed down on middle C, and the sound that emerged was pure and clear. But it wasn't just the note itself that filled the room. It was the way she played it, with perfect control and intention. Even a single note, when played by someone who truly understood the instrument, carried weight and meaning. The women noticed immediately. The sound was different from what they had expected. It wasn't the hesitant plink of an amateur. It was confident, controlled, and beautiful. "Oh my," Carol whispered, lowering her phone slightly. "That was lovely." Betty's heart hammered in her chest. One note had felt like opening a door she had sealed shut decades ago. But it also felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Try another one," Diane encouraged. "Maybe a few notes together." Betty hesitated. She knew that if she played more than one note, if she allowed herself to create even the simplest melody, there would be no going back. The careful life she had built would begin to unravel, but her fingers seemed to have a mind of their own. Almost without conscious thought, she played a simple scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. 8 notes that flowed together like water, each one perfectly placed, perfectly timed. The women exchanged glances. This wasn't what they had expected at all. "Betty," Linda said slowly, "are you sure you only took a few lessons as a child?" Betty's face flushed. She had gone too far. A true beginner wouldn't play a scale with such precision and fluidity. But she was committed now. She couldn't pretend anymore. "Maybe I took lessons for a little longer than I said," she admitted quietly. Carol put her phone away entirely. She sensed that whatever was happening was too important to treat as casual entertainment. "How much longer?" Betty looked at her hand still resting on the keys. "A few years." It was another careful understatement. She had studied piano for over 30 years, but she couldn't bring herself to say that. "Not yet. Would you play something for us?" Diane asked gently. "A real song? It doesn't have to be complicated." Betty closed her eyes and tried to think of something simple, something that wouldn't reveal too much about her abilities. But her mind kept drifting to more complex pieces, the music that had once defined her entire existence. "I'm not sure I remember anything complete," she said. "That's okay," Linda assured her. "Just play whatever comes to mind. Even if it's just a few measures." Betty's hands moved to position themselves for what she intended to be a simple folk song. But somehow, without her conscious decision, they found the opening position for Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. She realized what she was about to do and tried to stop herself. This piece was far too advanced, too revealing. But her muscle memory had taken over and her fingers began to move. The first chord that emerged from the piano was rich and complex, a harmony that seemed to fill every corner of the small community center. It wasn't the simple melody the women had expected. It was sophisticated, nuanced, and absolutely breathtaking. Betty's hands moved across the keys with fluid grace. 20 years of silence melted away as if they had never existed. Her fingers remembered every note, every phrase, every subtle dynamic change that made this piece so hauntingly beautiful. The 3 women stood in stunned silence. This wasn't a cleaning lady who had taken a few childhood piano lessons. This was a master musician, someone with years of serious training and experience. Betty lost herself in the music. For the first time in 2 decades, she felt complete again. The melody flowed from her fingers like a language she had almost forgotten, but could never truly lose. Each phrase brought back memories of concert halls, of audiences held breathless by the power of music, of the joy she had once found in sharing beauty with the world. The dynamics of the piece rose and fell like breathing. Soft, contemplative passages gave way to moments of passionate intensity, then retreated again into gentle reflection. Betty's whole body moved with the music, her shoulders swaying slightly, her head tilted as if listening to some inner voice only she could hear. Carol found herself holding her breath. She had attended classical concerts before, but she had never heard anything quite like this. The combination of technical mastery and emotional depth was overwhelming. Linda felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She didn't understand classical music particularly well, but she could feel the emotion pouring from Betty's performance. There was longing in the music and loss, and a kind of bittersweet acceptance that spoke to something deep in her soul. Diane simply stared, trying to reconcile the humble cleaning lady she had known for years with the accomplished artist sitting before her. It was as if Betty had been transformed before their eyes, revealed as someone entirely different from who they thought she was. The piece built to a climactic moment, and Betty's hands moved with surprising strength and agility across the keyboard. Her fingers flew through complex passages that would challenge professional pianists, yet she played them with an ease that spoke of countless hours of practice and performance. Then, gradually, the music began to wind down. The final phrases grew softer, more reflective, until the last notes hung in the air like a whispered secret. Betty played the final chord and let it fade into silence. For a moment, she kept her hands on the keys, her head bowed as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The room was absolutely quiet. The 3 women stood frozen, not sure if they should applaud, speak, or simply continue listening to the echo of what they had just witnessed. Finally, Carol found her voice. "Betty," she whispered, "who are you?" Betty slowly lifted her hands from the keyboard and placed them in her lap. The spell was broken. She was back in the community center, back in her simple life, back to being the quiet cleaning lady who preferred to remain invisible. But she could see in the women's faces that everything had changed. There was no going back to the way things were before. "I used to play," she said simply, her voice barely audible. "Used to play?" Linda repeated incredulously. "Betty, that was incredible. That was professional level. Where did you learn to play like that?" Betty looked at her hands, these hands that had just revealed her deepest secret. She had spent 20 years hiding, 20 years pretending to be someone she wasn't. But now the truth was out, and she felt both terrified and strangely relieved. "It's a long story," she said quietly. Diane stepped closer to the piano. "We have time," she said gently. "We have all the time in the world." Betty looked up at the three women, and for the first time she saw not just the organizing committee members who had asked her to play as entertainment. She saw people who had been genuinely moved by her music, people who deserved to know the truth about who she really was. Betty sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, her hands folded in her lap. The three women waited patiently, sensing that whatever she was about to tell them would explain the miracle they had just witnessed. "My name isn't really Betty," she finally said, her voice so quiet they had to lean forward to hear her. "Well, it is, but it's Elizabeth. Elizabeth Catherine Morrison." The name meant nothing to Linda, Carol, or Diane, but Betty said it as if it carried enormous weight. "I was born in Philadelphia," she continued, staring at the piano keys rather than meeting their eyes. "My mother started teaching me piano when I was 4 years old. She had been a music teacher before she married my father." Carol pulled up a chair and sat down, realizing this was going to be more than a simple explanation. "By the time I was 12, I was performing with the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra. My teacher said I had something special, something that couldn't be taught." Betty's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if the words were pulling her back into a life she had almost forgotten. "When I turned 18, I was accepted to the Curtis Institute of Music. Do you know what that is?" Linda shook her head, but something in Betty's tone told her it was important. "It's one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. They only accept about 4% of the students who apply. Getting in there meant everything to a young pianist like me." Betty paused and touched the piano keys gently as if greeting an old friend. "I studied there for 4 years. My professors said I had the potential for an international career. By the time I graduated, I was already performing with major symphony orchestras." Diane found herself trying to imagine the humble cleaning lady as a young concert pianist, but it seemed impossible. "For 15 years, music was my entire world," Betty continued. "I traveled everywhere. New York, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles. I even performed in Europe a few times. The critics were kind to me. They said I brought something special to the classical repertoire, something emotional and authentic." Her voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness that made the women's hearts ache. "I met my husband Richard at a concert in Boston. He was a violin teacher, much older than me. 20 years older, actually. Everyone thought I was crazy for marrying him, but he understood music the way I did. He understood what it meant to have your whole life wrapped up in something as fragile as sound." Betty smiled for the first time since she had started talking, but it was a bittersweet expression. "We were happy for 10 years. He would come to my concerts and I would listen to his students practice. We had a beautiful home with 2 grand pianos in the living room. We would play duets together in the evenings." The smile faded from her face. "When I was 43, Richard started forgetting things. Little things at first. He would misplace his keys or forget what he was supposed to teach in a lesson. We laughed about it. We said he was just getting older." Linda felt her throat tighten. She could see where this story was heading. The diagnosis came 6 months later, early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Richard was only 63, but the doctor said the disease was progressing quickly. Betty's hands clenched together in her lap. "At first, I thought I could manage both. I cut back on my concert schedule, but I still performed regularly. I hired caregivers to stay with Richard when I traveled. But as the disease got worse, he became frightened when I wasn't there. He didn't recognize the caregivers. He would cry for hours when I was gone." Carol wiped away a tear. She was beginning to understand the sacrifice Betty had made. "I had a choice to make. I could continue my career and put Richard in a care facility, or I could give up performing and take care of him myself." The room was absolutely silent except for the sound of Betty's quiet breathing. "The choice was easy, actually. Richard had supported my dreams for 10 years. Now it was time for me to support him. Betty looked up at the women for the first time since she had started her story. I canceled all my upcoming concerts. I sold both of our pianos to pay for Richard's medical care. I moved us to a smaller apartment where I could watch him constantly. Diane couldn't imagine the magnitude of such a loss. You gave up everything? Betty nodded. Everything except Richard. And for 12 years that was enough. Taking care of him became my new full-time job. There were good days and bad days, but we faced them together. 12 years? Linda asked softly. 12 years? The last 5 were the hardest. He stopped recognizing me completely. He was frightened most of the time, confused about where he was and who I was. But sometimes when I would hum to him, he would calm down. Music was the last thing that could still reach him. Betty's voice broke slightly on the last words. He died 5 years ago, peacefully in his sleep. By then, I had been out of the music world for so long that people had forgotten who I was. My contacts were gone, my reputation was gone, and honestly, my confidence was gone too. Carol leaned forward. But surely you could have started performing again? Betty shook her head. I was 55 years old and I hadn't performed professionally in over a decade. The music world is difficult even for young artists. For someone my age trying to make a comeback after so many years away, it felt impossible. So you became a cleaning lady? Diane asked, not unkindly. I needed to work. Richard's medical bills had eaten up most of our savings. This job offered steady pay and health insurance, which I desperately needed. And honestly, I liked the simplicity of it. After 12 years of dealing with doctors and insurance companies and the constant stress of watching someone you love disappear piece by piece, cleaning floors felt peaceful. Betty looked around the community center. I've been working here for almost 20 years now. I've watched hundreds of children learn to play piano on this old instrument. Sometimes I wanted to help them, to show them proper finger placement or explain how to phrase a melody, but that would have meant answering questions about how I knew so much about music. Linda was beginning to understand. You were hiding. I was surviving, Betty corrected gently. There's a difference. I built a simple life that asked nothing of me except showing up and doing my job. After everything I had been through, that felt like enough. The 3 women sat in silence, absorbing the weight of Betty's story. They were looking at someone who had sacrificed a brilliant career for love, who had chosen caring for another person over personal achievement. Betty, Carol said finally, do you miss it? The performing? The music? Betty looked at the piano, her expression unreadable. Every single day, she whispered. But missing something and being ready to face it again are 2 very different things. She stood up from the piano bench, smoothing down her simple cleaning uniform. And now you know why I clean this piano so carefully every night. It's not just an instrument to me. It represents everything I used to be, everything I gave up, and everything I'm still too scared to try to reclaim. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. These 3 women had come back to retrieve forgotten papers and had instead discovered that their quiet cleaning lady was actually one of the most remarkable people they had ever met. The next morning, Betty arrived at the community center expecting everything to return to normal. She had shared her story with 3 women who would probably go home, tell their families about the interesting discovery they had made, and then gradually forget about it as life moved on. But when she opened the door, she found Linda waiting for her with a cup of coffee and a determined expression. We need to talk, Linda said simply. Betty felt her stomach drop. She had revealed too much the night before, and now there would be consequences. Maybe they would think she had been dishonest about her background when she was hired. Maybe they would question whether someone with her qualifications should really be doing cleaning work. Linda, about last night, Betty began, but Linda held up her hand. Betty or Elizabeth or whatever you want me to call you. What you shared with us was incredible. But more importantly, what you played was incredible. Betty set down her cleaning supplies and looked at Linda warily. I've been thinking about this all night, Linda continued. The talent show is in 2 weeks. We have 37 acts signed up, mostly children playing simple songs or doing basic dance routines. It's sweet, but honestly, it gets a bit monotonous after the first 20 performances. Linda, I'm not sure where this is going, but I want you to perform. The words hit Betty like a physical blow. What? I want you to play in the talent show. A real performance, not as a gag or a curiosity, but as the featured artist. The closing act that people will remember long after they leave. Betty backed away from Linda as if she were suggesting something dangerous. No, absolutely not. Why not? Because I'm not that person anymore. I'm a cleaning lady. I clean floors and empty trash cans and wipe down pianos. That's who I am now. Linda stepped closer. That's what you do for work. It's not who you are. Last night when you played that piece, you became someone else entirely. You became who you really are underneath all this hiding. Betty shook her head frantically. You don't understand. I haven't performed in front of people in over 20 years. I wouldn't even know where to begin. You begin by sitting down at that piano and playing the way you did last night. That was different. That was just for you three. The idea of getting on stage in front of a real audience. Betty felt panic rising in her chest. Linda sat down on one of the folding chairs scattered around the room. Can I tell you something? My daughter Catherine is 16. She's been taking piano lessons for 8 years and she's pretty good. Not professional level, but good enough that she's performing in the talent show. Betty nodded, not sure where this was going. Yesterday, she came home from her lesson in tears. Her teacher had criticized her technique, told her she would never be more than an adequate amateur. Catherine said she wanted to quit piano entirely. Linda looked at Betty with intense focus. Then I came home and told her about what happened here last night. I described your performance, tried to explain the beauty of what we witnessed.
And do you know what she said?
Betty shook her head. She said she wanted to meet you. She said that if someone who works as a cleaning lady could play like that, maybe there was hope for ordinary people like her to create something beautiful too. The words hit Betty harder than she expected. She had spent so many years thinking about what she had lost that she had forgotten about what she might still be able to give. Linda, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't. The stage fright alone would probably kill me. What if it wasn't about you? Linda asked quietly. What if it was about all the young musicians in this community who need to see that music isn't just for the elite, isn't just for people who went to fancy schools and had perfect lives? What if it was about showing them that real artistry can survive any circumstance? Betty felt something stirring inside her, the same feeling she had experienced when her fingers first touched the keys the night before. It was small and fragile, but it was definitely there. I don't even own proper performance clothes anymore, she said weakly. Linda smiled. Carol owns a boutique. She's already volunteered to help with that. I haven't practiced seriously in decades. You have 2 weeks. And honestly, based on what we heard last night, you don't need much practice. Your hands remember everything. Betty walked over to the piano and sat down on the bench. She played a few random notes, thinking, what would I even perform? Whatever speaks to you. Whatever feels right. Betty closed her eyes and let her hands find a simple melody. It was a piece by Debussy, gentle and flowing, not too technically demanding but deeply expressive. As she played, she could imagine how it might sound in front of an audience. The community center holds about 200 people, Linda said, as if reading her thoughts. It's not Carnegie Hall, but it's a real audience of people who would appreciate what you have to offer. Betty finished the melody and sat quietly for a moment. What if I fail? What if I freeze up there or forget the music or make a fool of myself? Then you'll be human, Linda said simply. But what if you don't fail? What if you remind yourself and everyone else what you're truly capable of? Over the next few days, word began to spread through the small community. Carol and Diane had been discreet, but they had told their closest friends about the remarkable discovery they had made. Those friends told other friends, and soon there was a buzz of excitement about the talent show that hadn't existed in previous years. Betty found herself approached by curious neighbors who had heard rumors about the cleaning lady who was actually a professional pianist. She tried to downplay the stories, but people were genuinely interested in her background and excited about her potential performance. The local music teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, came to the community center, specifically to meet Betty. She had heard about the planned performance and was curious about this mysterious musician who had been hiding in plain sight. I've been teaching piano in this community for 30 years, Mrs. Rodriguez said after Betty had played for her. I can tell you that what you have is extremely rare. Your students were lucky to have learned from someone with your level of artistry. I never had students, Betty said. You will, Mrs. Rodriguez replied with certainty. After people hear you play, you'll have more requests for lessons than you can handle. Betty laughed at the idea, but as the days passed, she began to realize that Mrs. Rodriguez might be right. Parents were already asking if she would consider teaching their children. Young adults who had given up piano years ago were wondering if it was too late to start again. The week before the talent show, Betty made a decision that surprised even herself. She asked Linda if she could have access to the community center in the evenings to practice. Practice? Linda asked with a knowing smile. I thought you said you didn't need much practice. I lied, Betty admitted. I'm terrified and I want to be as prepared as possible. That evening, Betty sat down at the old piano and began to work seriously for the first time in 20 years. Her fingers were stiff at first and her stamina was limited, but the music was all still there, stored somewhere deep in her muscle memory and her heart. She practiced scales and exercises to rebuild her strength. She worked through pieces she hadn't touched in decades, finding that they came back to her more easily than she had expected. Most importantly, she began to remember the joy of making music, the sense of connection between her inner emotional world and the sounds she could create. On the night of the talent show, Betty stood backstage in a simple black dress that Carol had helped her choose. Her hands were shaking and her mouth was dry, but underneath the fear was something else. It was anticipation, excitement, and the faint memory of who she used to be. Linda introduced her to the audience simply. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elizabeth Morrison. Betty walked onto the stage, sat down at the piano, and looked out at 200 faces looking back at her. For a moment, she felt like she might faint. Then she placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. The music that filled the community center that night was more than entertainment. It was a homecoming, a revelation, and a reminder that some gifts are too powerful to stay hidden forever. As the last notes faded into applause, Betty realized that her life as a cleaning lady wasn't ending, but it was expanding to include something she thought she had lost forever. She was a musician again,